Superstrike, once people started to think about what it actually meant, sent ripples of fear through virtually every landlord and letting agent in the country. While Superstrike itself concerned a tenancy which predated the coming into force in 2007 of the deposit scheme rules, and then became a statutory periodic, the implications extend to just about every single assured short-hold tenancy going. Superstrike held statutory periodic tenancy was a new tenancy. So there's no difference between a statutory periodic arising or a renewal tenancy, a further contract after the initial fixed term has run out. The effect of the deposit must be transferred, otherwise the landlord could only rely on the deposit in respect of dilapidations in the original fixed term. Therefore, it is received again. That applies regardless of whether the original deposit was taken before the deposit regulations came into force. The key point here is each time there is a new tenancy, which includes a statutory periodic, the obligations of section 213 apply again. The tenancy deposit must be protected, although, as we'll see, it doesn't have to be re-protected, and the prescribed information must be served. That is a requirement under section 213. If each new tenancy is a new receipt of a deposit, even though it's kept in a scheme all the time, the obligations are triggered again and again. Does this mean that the deposit have to be re-protected? No. The deposit schemes are quite happy to hold a deposit as it goes over into a statutory periodic or even a new tenancy, so long as they're told, so long as they're provided with the details of the new tenancy or the start of a statutory periodic. So it doesn't have to be physically removed from a deposit scheme and re-protected. But it has still been received in respect of the new tenancy. Does this mean the reservice of the prescribed information? Yes, it does. And this is the problem. The prescribed information required under section 213 has to be reserved each time there is a receipt of a deposit in respect of a new tenancy. Renewal tenancy, statutory periodic, makes no odds. Had anybody been doing that? No. Very, very, very few landlords or letting agents had actually done this. Suddenly, virtually every landlord in the country was probably in breach. And quite possibly repeatedly. Renewal tenancies going on? Fine. Had they reserved prescribed info? Probably not. Each time, that would be a breach of section 213. Each time, that would potentially give rise to a claim for the deposit back and the 1 to 3 times penalty. So you imagine a situation where somebody's been on a renewal tenancy. So let's say the original tenancy was a 12-month term. They're signed up to a new tenancy after the 12 months, for another 12 months, so on and so on. That's happened 3 or 4 times. Let's say 3 times. 3 breaches. 3 potential claims for between 1 and 3 times the deposit. A mess. Also, of course, no section 21s can be served. There is, at least as yet, and David will go on to what's planned, no fix to this position. It probably means that an awful lot of section 21s being technically served now are technically not being served. Under the requirements of section 215, the only way in which a valid section 21 can be served, or rather a section 21 can be served, is if the prescribed information has been served late. So if prescribed information hasn't been served, the landlord can rescue the position, at least as far as the Section 21 goes, by serving it late. That doesn't get them off the hook for the 1 to 3 times penalty claim, but they can serve a valid Section 21. So, at least for landlords, the answer is going to be serve the prescribed info immediately, if you haven't done so on each renewal of the tenancy. Still potentially leave you on the hook for the penalty claim, but it would make serving a Section 21 possible. But a lot of landlords haven't. For the tenant side, it is always worth seeing what prescribed information has been served and when. And it has to be served in full. As Philippa said, following Einiger and Swindles, the prescribed information is an important aspect of the scheme, and it has to be fully complied with. Every I dotted and T crossed.
So does the landlord have to sign it then?
Yes. It can't be the same. You have to, well, I'll come on to this, but you have to make sure that the prescribed information is right for the new tenancy. Now, there's actually no requirement in the prescribed information order that the prescribed information does refer to a specific tenancy. But if you are updating the deposit details, it will set, it will refer to a specific tenancy. So if it gets the tenancy wrong and it refers to the first one, it's no good. If it talks about the tenancy start date as being the start of the original tenancy, then it's not valid as prescribed information. So everything has to be done as if it was a fresh tenancy, yes. Just a quick reminder of the prescribed information. Most of the deposit schemes offer templates. The trouble with templates is people fill them in very quickly, thinking the template does everything that's required. The templates don't do everything that's required, and they need to be filled in completely and have everything with them that there should be with them. So, people need to be very, very careful about making sure that is fully completed. It needs to be signed, the tenant must have a chance, although not an obligation to sign it. The scheme's own material needs to be provided. It says leaflet material, but actually in at least one of the schemes, it's not really a leaflet, it's their entire terms and conditions. There have to be the relevant references to deposit clauses in the tenancy agreement, setting out the conditions under which the landlord will make deductions from the deposit. It has to be served on relevant persons, and it has to refer to the correct tenancy, start date, and so on. Superstrike effect in action. This is a county court case, Gardner and McCusker, Birmingham County Court. So it's non-binding, but it does fit completely with Superstrike, and I think shows the direction that the courts would quite probably take. This was a Section 21 possession claim. The tenant defended on the basis that Section 213 had not been complied with because the prescribed information had not been served on the new tenancy. This again was, deposit was protected for the initial tenancy. There had been a further tenancy. So there was a defence and a counterclaim for breach of Section 213. The deposit was protected. There had been various attempts to serve the prescribed information. I think about 4, none of which were right. All missing certain bits of information or referred to the wrong tenancy or so on. And the court found that none of those attempts were valid. The court held that the prescribed information does not roll over, as the landlord had argued, in the same way that the deposit does not roll over, but is received afresh. a fresh receipt of the deposit did indeed mean that the Section 213 PI obligations arise. The Section 21 notice was not served, even though it had been. The deposit and a 2 times deposit penalty were ordered to be paid to the tenant. So Gardner and McClusker is exactly, if you like, an illustration of the what we would take as being the effects of Superstrike. Only county court, not binding, persuasive in its logic. It follows Superstrike clearly. There is a rumoured further case that we know of, or don't know much about it, but it's apparently going to the Court of Appeal. It uses an argument which was mentioned but not really as part of the logic of Superstrike, certainly not found on, which focuses on the mention of the initial requirements in Section 213 brackets 3 of the 2004 Act. We don't know enough about this one. The effects of it, I think, if the Court of Appeal actually went along this line, and I don't want to prejudge it in any way, shape, or form, but the effect of it would be to say that the initial requirements, if they weren't complied with in the time limit, the initial time limit, could never be put right. The only mechanisms for putting things right for landlords failing to either protect the deposit or serve the prescribed information are in Section 215, and basically it's giving the deposit back or late service of the prescribed information. There is no way to rectify a failure to meet the initial requirements of the scheme. Heaven knows if this argument will succeed. If it does, there is a really, really big problem for anybody who didn't meet the initial requirements of the scheme. We'll see. Just one to keep an ear open for. We'll be shouting about it very loudly if it comes to pass. There has been another case on Section 21 and failure or not to protect the tenancy deposit, which is a very, very odd decision of the High Court in a judicial review permission hearing called Tummond. It had actually reached this route by being a county court case which had then been appealed to a circuit judge, or attempted to be appealed to a circuit judge who had refused permission to appeal. The only route you can take from there is a judicial review of the refusal to give permission to appeal, which is how it ended up in the administrative court. What had happened was that the landlord had taken a deposit, had protected it within the 30 days, but before it was protected, the landlord had served a Section 21 notice. Now, what we all used to think was that that was not going to work. That the rule in Section 213 was Section 215 was clear. No Section 21 notice could be served until the deposit had been protected in compliance with the scheme. What the High Court found, and this was just a permission decision, was that there was a clause in the tenancy agreement which said that the landlord would protect the deposit within 30 days of receiving it. That this was a contractually binding obligation on the landlord to protect it, and that therefore the deposit was going to be protected in compliance with the scheme, and the Section 21 notice was valid. Effectively, keeping a hold of the deposit and then protecting it within the 30 days It was holding it under the scheme, or at least in compliance with the scheme. And given that the tenancy agreement said this was what the landlord would do, there was a clear indication that the scheme was being complied with. Bluntly, I think this is bonkers. I'm not going to mince my words. This is barking. It relies entirely on the landlord doing what they've said they're going to do. If the landlord says, fine, I will protect your deposit within 30 days, here's your Section 21 notice, and then doesn't, what happens to that Section 21? The requirement in the Section 215 says no Section 21 shall be served until the requirements, the regulations have been complied with. So if the judge says you are complying with the regulations by taking the deposit and intending to protect it within 30 days, that Section 21 is valid. But then if you don't protect it, what happens to that Section 21? It was valid when it was served. Does it become unvalid? It can't. It was served, validly served at the time. So if the High Court was right, there would be an absolute gaping hole at the start of the scheme where the landlord could serve a Section 21 going, I'm going to protect it, and then not. I don't think it makes sense. In addition, the High Court said this was nothing to do with the landlord's intention. This was about a contractual agreement in the tenancy agreement. This was a contractual commitment to protect. So it wasn't about the landlord's intention. Of course it's about the landlord's intention. They're saying, I will protect it within 30 days. And then if they don't? Yeah. So, it's not binding. It is a judicial review permission decision, so it's not binding on other courts. However, it's a High Court decision, and the county courts might decide to follow it. One would hope not, because the effects would be extremely messy indeed. So, we've got one case that's made a potential mess of things. We've got another case on the horizon which may have huge repercussions. And we have the effects of Superstrike probably making the large majority of Section 21 notices that have been served since the start of the deposit scheme invalid.